Welcome to the Head Shepherd podcast. I'm your host, Mark Ferguson, CEO here at NextGen Agri International, where we help livestock managers get the best out of their stock. Before we get started, thank you to our two fantastic sponsors for continuing to sponsor this podcast. MSD Animal Health is perhaps better known as Cooper's Animal Health in Australia and for their Allflex range across the world, with a comprehensive suite of animal health and management products. Honega is a one-stop shop for wool harvesting and animal fibre removal. The Honega team have a deep understanding of livestock agriculture, backed by Swiss engineering and a family business dedicated to manufacturing the best. We are grateful to our sponsors for their support, helping us bring Head Shepherd to you each week. And now it's time to get on with this week's episode. Welcome back to Head Shepherd. This week we're talking all things sheep feet, but before we jump into that, Sophie's written an article and we'll hear from Sophie about what that one's on.
Yeah, so I decided, what with mating around the corner for our Australian clients, to do a bit of an article about optimizing ram usage. There's many ways you can do it. There's single siring, there's multi-mating, there's ram lambs, there's two-tooth rams experience, there's old rams, there's ewe lambs mating. There's all these different ratios and optimum ratios. So I thought I'd look a bit into the science behind it and the research that's been done and just present you guys with that information. But yeah, just giving you the principles of good ram usage so that you can apply that to your farming system wherever in the world that would be.
Fantastic. Yeah, we certainly get plenty of questions around where or what percentages and what to wear and old to young and young to old and all the rest of it.
And when a lot of it is matching your lambing date to your pasture growth curve and just even little things like that. Even I've got a little section about how you look after the rams the 58 days prior to mating and stuff like that as well.
Yeah, cool. So, yeah, stop people playing the Hunger Games in the ram paddock and, yeah, lambing time being one of the key profit drivers, but not many people nail it. But anyway, well, that's an age-old problem, age-old challenge to get pushing that lambing back a little bit to match the pasture curve. And, there was heaps of people who will be arguing against that, but we know that that's pretty good evidence. That's how you optimise stocking rate and therefore maximise profit. But it does come with some challenges around having store lambs. But anyway, we won't get too deep into that. This week we have the great opportunity to talk to Jim Walsh and Kim Kelly, both from MSD, Jim in Australia and Kim in here in New Zealand. And yeah, we thought it was a great opportunity to talk through all things feet health. Obviously, MSD have got their Footvax product, which has saved a lot of people over the years. But there's a whole heap of things we go through around genetics and just management, and obviously trying to get ahead of the curve with feet health. It's one of those things that can be really debilitating for a farm business, and yeah, a good opportunity to talk through all of our experiences, I suppose, around feet health, and we'll get that show on the road. While we are on the topic of feet, it's ram nomination time again for the feet health progeny test. So that's our work funded by Animal Health Australia and Australian Wool Innovation, and supported by our partners at Murdoch University and a whole heap of other consultant groups that we're working with as well. It's some great work, really replicating what we did here in New Zealand to bring the footrot breeding value to Australia, as well as trying to understand a little bit about OID or scold and how that is related to footrot and genetics and that kind of thing. So, yeah, it's a really important piece of work. We know that feet health is really critical on a lot of areas, particularly in the higher rainfall, obviously. So, yeah, you've got the opportunity now to nominate your ram. So if you're a stud breeder and you've been sitting on the fence last year, we've got a few results from last year already. And, yeah, it's great. There's just this massive variation in the genetics of animals to handle foot pressure. And we know that going forward with what we've seen here in New Zealand is that people really put a lot of emphasis on that when they're buying rams. So particularly if you're in high rainfall. So if you are on the fence, I really would recommend getting in touch with the team here. Amy Lockwood is our project representative, or the team at Murdoch, but that'll be all. You can find all of that on our website or on the hub. But yeah, get in touch with Amy at nextgenagri.com as an absolute minimum. And yeah, it's a really, really good piece of work, and we'd love to have as many nominations as possible. Welcome back to Head Shepherd. We're going trans-Tasman today, joined by a couple of vets, one either side of the ditch. We've got Jim Walsh based in Australia and Kim Kelly based in New Zealand. Welcome, pair of you.
Hey, Ferric. How are you?
Good. Great to have you along. And we're talking feet today, which is everyone's favourite topic. Sadly, one of my things that we do like to talk about. Before we get into feet health and sheep, we might just get a quick intro from each of you. We'll start on this side of the ditch, Kim.
Cool, thanks. So I have been a vet for way too long, nearly 30 years. I actually started off my job in hot merino country, Central Otago, having grown up somewhere where there was no merinos. So I had a crash course in feet from a very young age, and blood testing full-walled merino wrinkly rams as a new graduate was character building. So my area is the lower, I cover the technical advisor for the lower half of the South Island for MSD New Zealand.
Perfect, thank you. Jim, we'll switch to you.
Yep. So I've been a vet for longer than Kim.
That's very much too long then.
My background, I grew up in a mixed sheep property in the southern tablelands of New South Wales, and did my vet work for a while. But I currently have worked for MSD for 10 years now as a technical advisor. I'm based in the Southern Riverina, and I cover South Australia, Northern Vic, and Southern New South Wales. But we cover a fair area when things pop up. So that's me. So yep.
Excellent. Right, thank you. Well, we'll cut to the chase. So we're talking feet health, and it's a significant problem in sheep. What are the sort of common diseases, problems in sheep feet that you see as you travel around, the pair of you?
Jim, do you want to go first?
It's so I do quite a bit of sheep work. I suppose my background growing up where I grew up, we actually had a significant feet health issue. We had an 800 mil rainfall, and we had crossbreds and merinos and all sorts of different challenges. And we had the typical foot abscess type thing. We had an outbreak of virulent foot rot in my late university career, so I got the experience of attempting to eradicate virulent foot rot from our place, which was we followed all the rules, and I think we succeeded. I know we succeeded in eradicating virulent foot rot, but we certainly had a ongoing benign and intermediate strains, I'd say, at different times. In my travels now through the Riverina, we have wet summers. We certainly see foot rot outbreaks of varying levels of virulence. We in other years we see a lot of foot abscess, a lot of heavy ewes and heavy rams that crash in a wet autumn, wet summer, and they're probably the two biggies. And certainly in flood times, which we get sometimes on the plains, sort of through northern Victoria and southern New South Wales, we'll see a bit of strawberry foot rot and orthovirus sort of proliferating on feet. So we get the whole spectrum, I suppose. But I would say that foot abscess and foot rot are the two biggies for me.
I'd agree from over here. We generally get a little bit more rainfall than they do over there. In fact, at the moment, we're having a month's rainfall in a day, apparently. So foot abscess is certainly a problem right at the moment, and very seasonal though, right? So wet spring will lead to a lot more foot rot in the typically dry areas of the country. But at the moment, I would agree with Jim in that foot rot and foot abscess would be the two biggies we see.
Cool. So, I mean, OID or ovine interdigital dermatitis or scald is, I guess, a lot of lambs running around in spring. Some of them looking like they're walking on hot tin roof at the moment. That's probably scald rather than the other two you've mentioned, or OID. Sorry.
Yeah, I think that's it's always topical. The question comes: is it scald or is it OID or is it foot rot? And it's actually really tricky. And but certainly you're right. I'm in the irrigation area here, so we certainly get a lot of red hot pastures, and you certainly get lame sheep. And I do think it's OID. When the question comes to me, I always go back and say, well, is there history on farm? What are the other sheep doing? And I think you can sort of start to narrow things down a little bit. And but yeah, scald is certainly something that is topical and a concern for people because you don't know where it's going to go. So you've got to, I suppose, people are very aware and very conscious of watching and waiting, but yes, in lambs it's an issue for sure.
Yeah, I'm going to go straight off script, but the OID, you mentioned hot pastures. Is it legume in the pasture just shading and moisture, or is there something to do with what they're eating?
Yeah, well, I think it's probably a little bit of both. I think there's I certainly think high energy and high protein diets and maybe mild laminitis and subacute acidosis and all that sort of thing can certainly contribute to lameness and issues and inflammation. But then you've also obviously got the irritation for wet pastures and moisture and all those things. And as with a lot of lameness issues, it's a combination of things. And that's, I suppose that's my experience. Kim, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, same. I definitely think you see it more on, and I don't know if it's the fact that there's more pasture there that they're standing on because it's longer and denser. than good old ryegrass. I don't know if it's because of that, but I agree with Jim is that I think there must be something happening on the inside of their, like a hoof, inside of their hoof that's predisposing them to stand in a different way, and then they're standing in this wet area. So yeah, I think that's a question for that probably no one knows the complete answer to yet. It's an area to look into for sure.
Yeah, you're right, Kim. There's a lot we don't know. That's right.
That's the beauty of biology. There's always something for us to find out. Yeah. And my favourite answer being it depends. Yeah.
I must use that.
Yeah.
I use that one a lot. So
yeah. Depending on where you live, and more probably in your neck of the woods, Jim, than Kim's, but foot rot or virulent foot rot particularly, is sort of a bit like leprosy. It's there's Australian legislation in place to restrict trade, and therefore sort of people tend to want to have benign foot rot rather than virulent foot rot, and therefore will say that's what they got regardless of what it is. But yeah, I guess just to make clear of where that sort of blurry line is between what would be called a virulent strain of foot rot and a benign strain of foot rot, and sort of maybe just walk us through that area a little bit.
Yeah, look, and it's. I think, Ferg, it is a blurry line, and I think the issue we have in Australia is, the states aren't aligned in their approach to diagnosis, managed. Like if there are control restrictions about even alignment of control restrictions and requirements, and then you have the state borders that are quite leaky. So you have sheep that will move from regulated states into non-regulated states. So it is a major discussion about what is virulent foot rot and what isn't, and also because of that difference, the non-alignment between states, we sort of get a bit of, denial, head in the sand type stuff, as well as the stigma associated means people don't go looking for help, I suppose. So I think the position I fall back on is what's presenting in the field. So there's a lot of foot scoring goes on over here with percentages and how bad the scores are and how many sheep. And I personally like that approach as a true expression of what might be happening. The trouble with that is that, if the environment isn't allowing expression, then it doesn't sort of tell you what strains potentially can do. And that's where the laboratory support comes in. And again, the issue that we have here is there's not alignment in the laboratory support and interpretation, I suppose, between states. So it is, I'll go back to that. It depends, Ferg, because it depends what state you're in as to what happens, and that does become confusing. And I do feel for the producers at times, because I think they shrug their shoulders and go, "Well, what do I do?" So that probably hasn't answered the question. But I do believe in the field diagnosis stuff, and that does depend on breed, environment, seasons, and all that stuff. But at the end of the day, it's about clinical expression for me. So that's where I go to. I think we should be going to.
So in theory, your benign strains don't have the same keratinase or whatever, so they actually they shouldn't be able to underrun very much. Is that the kind of?
Yeah, that's right. So we're not getting the owning running across the hill. We're not getting the number of feet affected because there's not the same. Less sheep, less feet, and the degree of underrun. And that degree of underrun is obviously what we can base our scoring on. And then we start counting feet and what percentage of feet are affected, what number of sheep are affected, and what number of feet are affected. And there's the magic grid that allows you to point to a benign, intermediate, or virulent strains, I suppose, at that time on that farm. So
yeah.
And is that something? Is the foot score? I know, Ferg, I think you do a fair bit of foot scoring, do you, or is that part of? Yeah, yep. Is that the same?
Yeah, I mean, we do it we do it hoping we've got a virulent strain, and then look at how animals react to that virulent strain, essentially. And so we see different expression, which is back to your breed point. Like within a flock, you'll have sheep or a whole sire group that don't have any underrunning, and another sire group that will be full of underrunning. And so again, if they were subgroups you're characterising on a farm, one would be declared a benign strain and one would be declared a virulent strain, but they'd be the same strain. But anyway, that's the challenge, obviously. And I mean, obviously, it's whatever you've got, it can cause issues. I guess maybe if we move on to, I mean, there is massive social stigma around it, even in New Zealand, where it's kind of, there's no government interaction, but you're still people don't like, it's not the first thing you bring up in conversation that you've got foot rot. Like it's sort of, so I guess what I see travelling around, and maybe I'll declare my hand first and then you can tell me whether you support it or not, but I see heaps of, particularly, I mean, I guess more benign strains, but I think you sort of get to the point where you either got foot rot or you're lying almost. Like there's a lot, depending on where you are in Australia or New Zealand, there's a lot of foot stuff around that people probably just don't want to have or don't want to talk about.
Yeah, and they don't, and it can vary, right, between seasons. So they can say, oh, I haven't got foot rot on my farm, and you know full well that they have. It's just that in this particular dry season, they're not seeing any clinical signs of it. So it's as you said, they either admit they've got it or they're lying. So there's an extent. There will be foot rot free properties, no doubt, but they may not know who they are.
Yeah, and I think you're right. Like that, and I love Australia, particularly, Jim, where there's sort of a place that sort of likes to believe it's foot rot free, but runs a hell of a lot of workshops on foot rot for a place that doesn't have it. So
yeah. Look, it's sort of an ongoing discussion. I actually pulled up some numbers from the endemic disease update from 2022, and it was actually encouraging to see a little bit of, I suppose, acknowledgement that there is a widespread issue. We talk about, New South Wales is saying they've got 60% of properties have got a benign strain.
Yeah, right.
1.5% are looking at intermediate or virulent strains. Tassie's 40% and 25% of the virulent strains and intermediates. Victoria's 50%. So there is an acknowledgement of a lot of benign.
Yeah, good.
Yeah, which is that's from reporting, but I suspect the farming community doesn't actually. They'd probably be surprised to hear that. But it's actually, I suppose that was actually quite encouraging that there's an acknowledgement it's an issue and the cost of it is significant. So, yes.
Yeah, and that would almost be a direct representation of the higher rainfall proportions of those states you mentioned almost.
You're exactly right. So when you start narrowing down to which corner of the state's got the higher rainfalls, that's where the numbers suddenly go through the roof, back up to a Tasmania type situation where they're talking, if you add it up, there's sort of 65, they're saying 80% of properties in Tassie have actually got foot rot going on to some degree.
Yeah. And I guess the reason we're talking about that is because we're trying to break the social stigma, like the same as having fly strike or clostridial disease or a million other things that we have in sheep. Like it's just one of those things that are part of, if you're going to be running sheep, you're going to have sheep diseases, and that's just how it rolls. And we need to get away from stressing about that and working about the solutions rather than sort of pretending we haven't got it, because that's not much point.
Yeah, and not only that, Ferg, I think because there's a fear of a diagnosis, then you don't actually go and get help for the other causes of lameness, which can be very impactful at times. So that's actually, to me, the major concern. So, yeah.
Yeah. I guess there is a bit of, there's a million sort of folklores when it comes to sheep feet and foot rot, so we'll cover a few of them. But I guess one big one is that kind of some properties have kind of got foot rot and it'll live in the soil for years or whatever. I think people really do need to understand that it's not like it's in the sheep mostly. It's not often off the sheep, and so if the sheep are clean, then the farm is clean pretty much. So how long can we? I guess it's one of those probably it depends answers, but what's the sort of maximum we can expect bacteria to live in, like the foot rot bacteria to live in the soil?
Kimmy, I'll handball this one to you.
So it depends.
You went to vet school more recently, apparently. So.
It depends. Jim, we were talking about it the other day, and I think we said 7. Did we say 7 days in pasture normally, Jim? But it could be a little bit longer if it's in mud and stuff. So maybe 14 days in mud, 7 days in pasture. Is that kind of a standard? Do we agree?
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. I think there's a recent paper a few years ago now that talks about 14 days in mud, which I suppose puts a bit of a different thinking about maybe spelling paddocks and things at different times. But yes, that's where I sit, 7 days and 14 days in mud. And
you'd imagine that's a decay curve, like there'll be heaps there on day 1 and none by day 14. So by the time you get it out to 7+, you're probably the population. I mean, it's an anaerobic bacteria, so it's got to be hidden away somewhere, buried down, and then obviously an exposed foot has to hit that bacteria. So it's kind of, when you think about the chances of spreading it seems low, but obviously it's quite good at it. But so I mean, I guess the point is if you spell it for a couple of weeks, then like if you took all the sheep off a farm for, we'll say 3 weeks to be really careful, then there should not be any foot rot on that farm. And I guess we always, like you said, Kim, a lot of people think, oh, it's gone, and then they blame the magpies for bringing it back or whatever. But the reality, it's just been hanging around in a sheep's foot somewhere and little pockets. And I think any of us that have paired a few feet looking for it, it's amazing some of the little pockets that hide away.
Tiny pocket, and you dig deeper, and there it is, right?
Yeah.
I think the other one that gets forgotten a little bit is that co-grazing with cattle. I sort of think a lot of people don't realise that we can get carriers that of any virulence that don't express in the cattle world. And I've get asked sometimes about how long can cattle carry it for, and I can't find any data or sort of solid discussion about that one. Have you come across anything, Kim or Ferg?
No, but the other thing we have here is deer. We have a lot of farmed deer, and there's some deer that are in shared areas, not necessarily the same paddocks, but shared areas, and so that's going to. I have seen deer with what appeared to be. Initially, we thought it wasn't sure if it was schooled, but we're not sure whether it was schooled or whether it was actually perhaps a little bit of foot rot, right? It's just the bacteria. So, but as far as how long it could jump from one to the other, we don't really know.
No, yeah. I guess that's anyway. So, so co-grazing, and then I guess you've got wild deer coming and going is another challenge as well. So
it is. That's actually a growing challenge in our part of the world, that the feral deer population is exploded. So I think that's something that we probably haven't considered enough in Australia. So that's something that we need to be aware of. So
and it kind of probably lines up with the thinking that the people that stress most, in wetter areas, people that stress most about foot rot are the ones that don't have it, because you're always worried about those incursions and when you've got a completely naive mob of sheep, and when they do get it, we've all seen how exciting that can be. And so that's. With those different incursions, either feral, like sheep coming through fences or deer jumping fences, there's a reason that people stress when you're completely clear, when you stress about getting it.
Yep, absolutely. Yep.
Obviously, Australia's had a red hot go at eradication and hasn't been successful. There's a combination of factors that sort of make eradication really difficult. I mean, and obviously weather's the key one, that you can kind of get lucky with the weather or really unlucky, and it's a massive disease of the weather. What's the likelihood of sort of successfully eradicating the disease, and why is getting rid of virulent easier than getting rid of benign?
Yeah, so if we look at Australia, you're right, Ferg, we've had a long time. I mean, having lived and farmed and vetted in New South Wales for the majority of my life, and with the foot rot control program that started in the early 90s, you would have thought if we could have eradicated virulent foot rot, we should have. We've had significant droughts where if there is and there certainly is a natural healing and process, but there's obviously carriers that survive through the dry times. So I suppose there's that part of the weather issue where we things go into the little nooks and cracks in sheep's feet and survive through multiple years probably and express in the next wet time, and you think you haven't got an issue, and you may not have an issue. And the other issue is that sheep moving to a new environment you would, and I think people do very often, and probably most of the time, declare their sheep clean of virulent foot rot, which is part of our sheep health statements. And it's only when they move to a new environment that it actually expresses. So there's that concern. There is the stigma stuff and the people putting their head in the ground, but I actually don't think that's the major issue. I just think it's a very hard disease to actually manage and control, and the virulent stuff unexpressed in certain environments and certain breeds. We certainly have, a lot of your British breeds will carry strains of foot rot that if they get into a fine wool merino flock will express excessively and strongly, and so that's another issue. And I think if we start looking at, the critical control point for an eradication program is the summer inspections. And you can certainly, if you've got virulent strains, you can actually find it because it expresses well. The benign strains are less, the intermediate or lesser than intermediate strains just don't express as much. So they're just hard to detect at that critical control point. So, I just think that's a large part of the issue, that things don't express when you're looking, sort of thing. Do people actually try and eradicate in New Zealand, or do we live with it?
I think possibly. I think the thing that you can do everything perfectly on your farm, but unless you're a completely closed, biosecure farm, it's a chance, right? It's opened up. So I guess we have farmers who will say, not just for foot diseases, for everything else, they will suggest that they will be trying to eradicate something. And then you turn around and find out that they're not a closed property, they're not biosecure. And I would challenge people to say that they are, especially these extensive high country properties. I don't think they're completely biosecure. And so unless you can ensure that, I always do a talk and show a picture of Alcatraz, the island, and I'm saying that it's pretty easy to get that biosecure, but more like that. But they tried that. They tried to. That's why they put it there, right, to keep people there. But other than that, I think it's a struggle, and I think maybe we need to stop trying to say, okay, we're going to eradicate it, and look at, as you said, like you are in Australia, more of a control program.
Yeah, and I think that's a good point, Kim. I think a lot in say Victoria, where there's less requirement to eradicate, I think the starting point of the conversation is it, if you can eradicate, can you keep it out? And if you can't keep it out, if you're a trader, if your biosecurity, your fences aren't great, or you've got ongoing biosecurity issues, it's very expensive to take on an eradication program. And if in 2 years' time you're back to square one, is that the right thinking? There's not that much margin in the job really. So yeah.
Yeah, and I guess there's enterprises like seed stock enterprises where it's in their interest to be free of lots of diseases, and feet being one of them, and a major. But then in New Zealand, because it's kind of more socially acceptable, I suppose, there's plenty of people that seed stock that have some form of. In fact, we rely on them with our testing to have some form of lurgy there that we can put under pressure and see which ones get it the worst. And often if you've got it at home, then that's a safer place to buy around than one that hasn't got it, because at least you know it's been challenged. But anyway, we'll get into that as we go through. We'll just really quickly, we sort of touched on OID or scald, just the difference between sort of what that is and isn't, I suppose, in terms of footrot and OID. I mean, that's obviously just not nodosis isn't present. Is that the big difference?
Essentially, right. So you've got half of it there and not the other half, but it's kind of a continuous scale, right? As you said earlier, OID, a lot of stuff that is probably early footrot gets called OID.
Yeah.
And maybe vice versa. Maybe stuff that people think it might be actually footrot is school. But as Jim said, if they've got a history and look at all the other stuff, often lambs, like really often lambs in the spring, which are lame, is probably, and we hate saying that, OID. But Jim, do you think that would be a fair comment?
No, I agree. I think time's a wonderful thing. It will allow expression of underrunning if it's there, if there's nodosis is there. And I've certainly seen very young lambs with underrunning and early stage underrunning, and depending on how long you let it go for, before you act to sort of suppress that expression of disease, you can sort of get a picture of how nasty the bug might be. But if with time it doesn't develop into underrunning, then it's probably scald. So, but probably it depends, and it probably are great words, aren't they? So it's hard.
Yeah. Couldn't have a vet talking without having some sort of probably and depends, or a scientist of any description, I should say. So obviously OID or scald is other bacteria or other inflammation, just not the causative one that's got the keratinase that becomes underrunning.
Yeah, that's right. And I suppose that is the other option. If people really want to look, they can go swabbing and find a denodosis, and suddenly you can say, well, that's actually the foot rot bacteria. Yeah. And then if you want to go further, you can sort of check if your elastase and activity, impact and things like that. So there is that pathway, but I suspect a lot of people wouldn't. They give it time and treatment and see how they respond. So
yeah, right. We've talked plenty about the disease, so we might start talking about how we fix it or how we manage it more as a better way of talking about that. But I guess what we see out there is those that are consistent with their management and have a good plan in place, probably infrastructure, are the ones that kind of, with or without benign virulent, whatever they want to call it, they're the ones that kind of end up with an effective management strategy and probably has the least impact on their profitability and sheep welfare. What's the sort of components of an effective management strategy?
Yeah, so Kim, do you want to take this one on? I mean,
I'll do a couple and then you can do a couple.
Righto, sounds good.
How's that?
You start with it. You do the easy ones, Kim.
I'll do the easy ones and then I'll leave him the hard one. You're not silly. I'm not silly. I guess. Well, I've already talked about one. The look at the biosecurity. So what comes on and off or onto your farm is one. You're going to talk about genetics, Ferg, so I'm not going to talk about that. So quarantining, I wrote a list. The things such as looking at something before it comes on your property to make sure it doesn't have issues, and not just if it's limping or not is not a good enough way to diagnose it. It's not an option, right? So we talked about, and it's been controversial, right? Trimming feet, so a diagnostic trim to have a look and see if there's actually something going on. You've got the underrunning, in compared to a full trim that you might need if you know that there's a foot that's got the problem with it. So trimming is part of it for sure. Foot bathing, we have. There's still a little few people over here that use formalin, but most people have moved away from that and are using zinc sulfate. But actually, good segue to you, Jim. You were talking the other day about something else that they're using in their foot baths. Do you want to share that with the Tim?
Yeah, so the sodium lauryl sulfate, so basically a wetting agent, a detergent that allows a bit more penetration. It was back in the in my early days as a young vet, a long time ago. There was a product called Footrot out there that was basically already a 10% zinc sulfate with I think 1% sodium lauryl sulfate pre-mixed and used as a foot bath, and that was ready to use and used in great volumes in the early 90s where I used to work. But these days you can buy that sodium lauryl sulfate separate to your zinc sulfate bags and do your own mix. And look, I think it was better than straight zinc sulfate, I suppose. But zinc sulfate, 8 metre foot bath through zinc sulfate is sort of what's recommended here. Walk through and as control, a good, it's been long accepted as a good control spread type tool. That one is that 8 metre story. Is that your talk over there as well?
A lot of standing here. A lot of standing for 20 minutes.
Yeah.
So
certainly that gets done here, but not as much, I suppose. So I suspect.
Yeah. The sodium lauryl sulfate one is a question I get a little bit. So it's just speeding up penetration of zinc into the
hoof. Yeah. And my understanding is, and it's a bit like standing. My understanding is with the sodium lauryl sulfate or standing for a length of time, that just allows a sort of a depot of the zinc to sit in the hoof and then pay out over the next length of time. So allows lets you not have to foot bath as often to control, I suppose, is my understanding. So
Yeah. Kim, we might just go back to that diagnostic trim. So if I'm buying 5 rams, I'm bringing one to my farm, and I want to be clear, that's a like foot shears plus a knife into actual groove and sort of cleaning out all little spots that could hide and making sure.
Yeah, so rather than sort of going, it's like an exploration mission, right? Going and starting the trim and visually looking at the foot between the toes and everything to begin with, and then doing not just trim it right back till it bleeds. It's not what we're talking about. We're talking about sort of nipping away until you find an area that you're not happy with, and then, as you said, using a little knife or a little something to dig in there and see if you can how far it goes if it is truly underrun. Not a chop it down till it's really, really short and looks pretty. That's not really a diagnostic trim.
Yeah, cool. Just wanted to clarify that. And then is there any other – I know some people, part of their quarantine process will drop them onto grates, obviously, off the trailer or whatever, so that they're not going onto the farm. They're obviously quarantined from other sheep. They ideally aren't touching soil. They're trimmed. Is there a long-acting antibiotic that you would suggest does that do anything, or is that just to make you feel better?
Jim, do you want to grab that one?
I suppose in my experience, yes, that is done, I think, with low numbers of high-value stock coming out of farm as a cover your tail type exercise. I suppose my only comment about that is we know that antibiotics as a treatment tool, they're not 100%, and it's a bit of it's not a trap. I think people are very aware of it, but relying on antibiotics to sort of guarantee an eradication is dangerous, because you possibly end up with you end up with a percentage of sheep that don't respond or don't fully respond to the antibiotic and end up as carriers, and that might break down in the future. So I think that's probably more important if you're going down the eradication path or the control path and using antibiotics in those really bad feet, that you acknowledge that they're still carriers and they're still going to break down. So, but yes.
Good point.
Yeah.
So here we've got obviously standard zinc sulfate. I walk through a lot of people that get into that management sort of mindset will just walk them out through zinc every time in the yards. So that's more of just a bit of a safeguard. You're just keeping disease at bay a little bit, which I think a lot of people have been really careful to continue to do that, have done a pretty good job of keeping things under control. What's next in our management tool set?
So we over here, Footvax is certainly used as a boost to the immune system. If we look at, as Kim's talked about, it's about biosecurity and inspections and making sure that what you bring on, you're avoiding sort of the issue where you can. I suppose we've touched on just briefly treating, but I do think if we're talking about control, then the foot bathing's the major tool. But it depends on how much labour you've got and how well set up you are with infrastructures, how often you can do it. So that's where I think the vaccine discussion starts. There's currently in Australia and New Zealand and over other places, there is the Footvax vaccine, the multivalent vaccine that's gives a level of protection against reinfection. So we talk about it being 80% effective against controlling spread, and I think that is certainly one of the tools that people in Australia do use at times, depending on the situation. It certainly helps with labour. It is quite effective in keeping sheep up and walking, and a lot of people here use it sort of pre-lambing to sort of make sure they get through that spring lambing period so the sheep don't crash while they've got lambs at foot. It's not a silver bullet. It doesn't sort of stop all infections, but it certainly keeps sheep fit and healthy. The welfare side of it's a very positive thing, and certainly the production side of it is positive as well. So I think that's another tool that is probably needs to be considered.
Yeah, and if we just drill into that for a little bit, and you did mention silver bullet, and that's what people love when, like every farmer ever, including me, when I have been running farms, or small lease blocks, everyone's looking for a silver bullet, and obviously, ideally, that we'd give them one jab and they'd be cured forever. That isn't the case, but I guess what is best use case of, actually we've already talked about when that sort of works, but I guess what's that protection look like? How would we maximise it's not a forever vaccine, so we have to manage its use. So what does best case use of Footvax look like?
Kimmy, you've been doing some more detailed work.
I guess that it's been around a long time, and what we've found is some people have historically gone off recommending it or thinking that it didn't work, when I think they were the timing of the vaccination wasn't ideal. So catering the time, the labels, I believe, in Australia and New Zealand both say the same. They say you're kind of looking 12, 16 weeks protection. So you've got to work backwards from when your risk period is. If your risk period is in spring, if it's going to be a wet spring, or who knows the way the weather's changing, right? But giving it, the risk period is probably all year at the moment.
Right.
If it's going to be for spring, then you need to work backwards and think, okay, so in the winter, that's going to be the time that I'm going to use it to give that cover for that period of time. We're checking the labels are the same. And so the Australian label and New Zealand label both say ideally 2 shots, but you do have a whole heap of flexibility from 6 weeks to 12 months between the first and the second shot. So there'll be farmers that will use 2, and then going forward, they might just pop one in, as Jim said, before the spring, so that they've got those 3 or 4 months of the spring where they're covered.
So it's heightened performance, if you like, for want of a better term, is that 12 to 16 week period. Is that post second vaccination, or so it's
yes,
yeah,
yes,
yeah,
or post the booster. So
or post,
or post the annual booster. So
yeah.
It's not going to last for 12 months. So giving them a shot in July and expecting it to cover them for spring and the autumn it's not going to work, right? It's not going to. It's not going to, as you said, be a silver bullet that's totally going to remove the problem. So it's all about timing.
Yeah. And we know, like, any vaccination obviously heats animals up a bit, as obviously they've got to react, their immune system's got to respond. So when you don't want to be doing it kind of the day the ram's going out, so it takes a bit of planning to make sure you sort of got it at a non-critical period of the reproduction cycle and that sort of stuff.
And Fergie said it, planning's the essential part of it. So, your rams, spermatogenesis, all that sort of stuff, you want to have them set up sort of before that critical time, so 4 to 6 weeks out at least. It is any vaccine, as I said, will cause a systemic reaction and can upset things, but we don't think it's a big thing on ovulation and like that. So certainly you can.
Okay. Yeah.
But I think a pre-lambing treatment, sort of 4 to 6 weeks out with the other clostridials or drenches or whatever you might be doing, is not a bad place to be putting it. And then there's a lot of flexibility about when to use it, and does depend on when the spread period is. As we've got places where I know it gets used into the spring, coming into the spring lambing, and then if they've got a wet summer or they're running under irrigation, they might actually give a booster shot in December, and suddenly you've sort of got to do your sums. But certainly you've got to, and that's an example of planning. So there's plenty of guys out there with spreadsheets and things about months about when they go in and when they do their rams, and just get really, because you do have to plan ahead. You can use it in the face of an outbreak, but because there is a bit of a curative claim, but at the end of the day, you don't want it getting away. So,
So if you banged it in your replacement ewes once you know who they are, and then annually sort of pre-lamb, then you'd sort of have depending on when your risk period is, I suppose, as you just said.
And that's right. And it's sort of interesting in Australia because we have a sort of two, as you well know, we've got the spring lambers and then we've got the autumn lambers. So the guys are throwing rams out the next few weeks, and it will very much depend on what the autumn does as to whether they act. And I know plenty of guys last year that we've had a few wet summers here in the Riverina, and also should say that in the northern Victoria stuff, and people were sort of setting up to protect their ewes during an autumn lambing, and they didn't have to bother. They gave themselves a primer, and that didn't bother with the booster because the autumn was quite dry here. But then they've got that up their sleeve to give a booster coming into the spring if it does get away from them in the spring.
Yeah, it's good to know you've got 12 months to get that booster into them. Yeah. I guess the other end of the spectrum, is there any? What's the upper limit? How many times can I be jabbing for Footvax into my sheep?
Good question.
Sure.
It depends.
Thank you. The economics will probably pull you up, obviously. And
I think that's right, Ferg. I've certainly had that comment with people who are really desperate to get on top of things, and they say, "I'm just going to vaccinate all summer," and you've got to just stop and do your numbers, and it's be strategic. Use your foot bathing through that. If you get a bit of a thunderstorm through the summertime, and it certainly can suddenly flare up, but you might just manage that with a foot bathing program that might only require 1 or 2 foot baths, and you're back to a dry and away you go again. So you've got to be a bit strategic about things. And, but certainly there are plenty of people that vaccinate 3 times in a year where they've got the wet summers and pivots and things like that in critical groups. So
no, for sure. One thing you mentioned infrastructure a couple of times, and I think one thing I've witnessed, people have sort of gone from clean to having footrot and sort of tried to have temporary foot bars and moving stuff around. And I think the day you just bite the bullet and put some infrastructure in to handle, so you're not having to shift sheep a long way to get them through a bit of zinc.
That's right.
That's when your life changes then. That's when you can actually get ahead.
You're right. Satellite yards and portable yards and things, and you're right. It does. It saves a lot of time and heartache and risk management stuff. So I totally agree. And you're right. You see people invest, and it's a great investment. So it's expensive.
Go and buy a truckload of concrete and some Footvax and hook into it. But it's a real battle unless the infrastructure's there. We've talked a fair bit about footrot abscesses, and we sort of talked about these before, but abscesses and sort of white line separation or shelly hoof are sort of commonly maybe confused with footrot. Maybe just quickly talk about the differences, and do you see much confusion out there?
Kim, you probably see a bit more foot abscess than me, I suspect.
Yeah, I guess if people know how to have a pairing, we talk about the diagnostic pairing and trimming again, the foot abscesses, in my experience, are often rams 5 minutes before they're supposed to go on with the ewes.
or twin-bearing ewes 5 minutes before they're meant to lamb.
Yes, before they're meant to lamb. And so often, and often it's a generalisation, right? But they will be 3-legged lame. They will be lifting the foot. They won't just be tender, walking on a hot tin roof, as you said. They will actually be standing there with their hoof in the air and it's a bit swollen. And in that case, if you're quick, straight in there with antibiotics, Jim will, as a vet, when you go to a horse with a lame, with a foot abscess, you will get instant recovery if you can find that abscess and dig it out. And these sheep with foot abscesses are kind of similar, right? They're really sore. The shelly hoof, the overgrown stuff, we don't see as much, but it's more individual cases than a flock problem. Like you'll see a few sheep with foot abscesses, you generally won't see a good proportion. Well, that's what it's like here, Jim. Is there any difference?
Well, I suppose in preparation for this, I actually started looking into shelly hoof a little bit, and I think the general comment is probably we all know what shelly hoof is, and basically it's a separation between the sole and the wall of the hoof, and then basically the gap that opens up there can be very large, and it can often be not infected, so it's basically just a visual
dirt trap
issue with not much lameness, but but it also all depends if it's that white line, and I think there's a lot of learning from the dairy industry and other species where you can certainly get infections up there that will sort of sit in pockets and break out the coronet, and they can certainly be lame. And so I just think that it's probably a little bit underdiagnosed, or we don't look closely because we've got such numbers, I suspect. But I do think that shelly hoof at times does cause confusion to people who aren't going to step forward and get some advice or help. and that reassurance, and perhaps you've got to be careful you're not treating with antibiotics something that doesn't need treating with antibiotics and all that sort of stuff. So, I do actually wonder whether we sort of need to think about that Shelley hoof and that white line discussion a bit more, because I suspect maybe we don't hear about it, Kim. So I know with my background, I've run sheep all my life, and when you're looking at feet, you don't spend lots of time looking at them, but and I suspect I've moved. I haven't given it due attention, but that's probably that's because of a numbers game. So
totally.
But I do think there's probably confusion there. So
yeah, cool. And I guess that moves us into foot shape structure. Generally, it's all a mix of the things that are under some form of genetic control. And I think, we've sort of got a project running at the moment. It's probably hoping to find the wrong way to say it, but if we could find a foot abscess outbreak in some sheep with some pedigree, we'd be really keen to kind of, because it is sporadic and often expressed in really heavily pregnant ewes, and that's sort of like, it's kind of the curse of good farmers, I reckon. Like, you get fat ewes with plenty of lambs on board, and then bang, they only got 3 legs to walk on. Yeah. But I guess we are really interested. We don't know the genetics of that, but it makes sense that all these things have some genetic component. But you'd see, obviously you've mentioned merinos, but you'd see a fair few sort of breed differences or line differences as you travel around. Yeah,
I think, Ferg, I totally agree. I even with foot rot and disc lameness in general, if you incorporate a culling program into your operation, then that's sort of a great way of, making the problem go somewhere else, but also it's a natural selection type tool, so it sort of supports the fact that genetics is really important. And I think you've touched on foot structure there. That's something I think is a bit of a lost skill over here. I think certainly when I was growing up was very much a focus for everybody, but I don't know that it is quite as much anymore, and that may be wrong. But as I wander around a few places and look at foot structure, I think it's not that great in a lot of places. So, yep.
Yeah, and I think that's a good point. We do, and we've sort of, I don't know, we're bringing back the ancient art maybe, but the last 3 or 4 years we've been foot scoring. So we now score side shape, foot roll, foot twist, which has got nothing to do with, it's just a structural thing. But we're scoring that on lots of animals these days. We've got Animal Health Australia and AWI supporting that, which is really cool. So anyone listening that is a seed stock producer and wants to get involved, make sure you get in touch with one of us. But we're certainly seeing massive, I reckon, jumps forward with just getting really focused. Like, everyone can convince himself it's a good sheep if you only look from the sort of hocks up. But often, and I think the beauty about scoring it we've found is that it forces you to stare at them properly. Like, you're right, Jim, it's a numbers game, you're belting through them. But if you've actually got someone there whose job is to tell you the number, you have to stop and you have to look at every foot on that sheep. And I reckon that's been the real game changer for us. Like, you can kind of, particularly in merino sheep, you kind of get excited by the wool and you forget about looking at everything else. And same with a good crossbred sheep that's got a great carcass or whatever, you get pretty excited and forget to look at the actual foundation bit that's going to get them walking around on the
They've got to walk. They've got to walk, don't they?
Yeah. So we're hoping to get breeding bays for those structural traits. There's already sort of versions of them, but we're hoping to get, as part of this project, is to have, same as we've got in cattle, to have actual breeding bays for foot structure, so that we can, because certainly, as you'll know more than most, like, it's such an environmental thing. Some of these, like, you go to one place that's had them on barley feeders or running in clay or whatever, you've got a very different foot than one that's running around on the Central Otago on some rocks. Like, it's a very different foot structural, and for most of us, it's impossible to tell what's genetic and what's environmental. You sort of rock up to a ram sale and you go, oh, it's great feet. Has it been trimmed? Has it been run on rocks? Has it been run on sand? Where has it been and what's it doing? So
very true.
And then you add that to a bit of straw or a bit of sawdust or something that they're standing in and make it impossible to see anyway. So.
That's right. You have to walk them down the aisle. So, So I'm interested in what you're doing, Ferg, with the genetic side of things too, with the actual genomes. Is that something that what are your thoughts on that stuff?
Yeah, so we've really clearly shown that there's massive genetic variation in foot rot susceptibility. And what we haven't done, which is what we're trying to do in Australia at the moment, is to look at OID or scald separately. So we've always, all of our challenges here have been full-blown nodosis present. But what we also want to do is say, well, if nodosis isn't present and there's just a scald outbreak, are the same sheep like more or less susceptible to scald? We want to form that correlation, because that sort of frees up we don't need to have nodosis on farms to then find the resistant ones. If like that'd be perfect if there's a favourable correlation there. But I mean, anecdotally, which is scary, but like maybe OID is actually a ramped up immune system. So maybe the foot rot resistant ones have worse OID. It's like one that'd be a bad outcome, but it's not impossible to kind of build that hypothesis. So that's the kind of stuff we want to unravel. But we're certainly here in New Zealand. We've been going nearly 12 years with the foot rot work, and yeah, it's amazing what genetics will do. It's just phenomenal. We've got breeding values now that are out to sort of, well, the numbers don't really mean anything, but our -1 type rams, which are one full foot score better genetically. So that's a progeny average score 2, which is not quite underrunning or whatever, but you'd have to have one. That's all of that. Well, that animal is now only a score 1, so it's got no foot rot at all, or no ID, no ID at all. Yeah, so the power of genetics to change this game is enormous, and all it takes is people to stop pretending that they haven't got it and to start scoring it. And we've got some really good breeders in New Zealand have gone really hard at it, and same in Australia. There's a few guys there that have gone out of their way to make sure they've got challenges on lease farms and whatever to make sure, put cull rams into cull challenges to get that outcome. And yeah, I mean, what we're seeing is that, yeah, I think it's working on all aspects. Like you can work on ewes and cull. We see a lot of people back when we started, maybe people would cull ewes with foot rot, and then they go and buy the rams from the same place in the same way they always had, and so half your genetics is always watering down any good work you're doing at home. So it's kind of helping people get both parts of that equation sorted. You can cull your ewes, and then you make sure the rams you bring in are also resistant. And so, yeah, the foot and the breeding value, the work that we're doing now with Animal Health Australia and AWI and Murdoch Uni, I should mention, it'll hopefully bring that breeding value to Australia, and then we'll be on the same sort of terms, which will be awesome, because what we know, anything with genetics, once you start measuring it, you can move it, and until you measure it, you've got no hope. No. And so it's been great actually. Like I've looked at way more feet than I thought I ever would need to, but it's it is, I don't know, it's just to see, and places now that kind of this time of year would be tailing ewes and culling 5, 6, 7, 8% of ewes with bad feet are just, they're all running through the tailing yards and not having to cull those ewes. And like just that shift, the people that have really gone hard at it, I think kind of not quite putting the digger through the zinc trough yet, but they're not too far away from that sort of where that bit of infrastructure is sort of going to sit there pretty idle, like the old spray dip did, I suppose. But and I think the power of again, it's no silver bullet either. It's about you get the genetics right, and then you get your vaccination program in place, you get your trough. Like you don't, obviously, you probably get to a point where maybe they are genetically in a much better place, but you're still going to have a histogram, so there's still going to be some susceptible ones in there. So it's kind of, I think what the beauty of the disease traits is that you're changing the environment as you change the genetics, because there's less, if you've got less bacteria around because you've got less really heavily infected ones, then and that like there's not many. I don't think there's many things in livestock and ag where you get sort of free lunches, but this could be one of them where it kind of moves in a favourable way quicker than what you wanted it to or what you thought it could, which is pretty cool.
It's really cool.
Exciting.
It is good. It's really good.
Anyway, we better wrap it up there. We're heading towards an hour, which will put some sort of record on it. So but I guess with 2 guests, we're allowed to go a bit longer. But I know Kim's got a hard stop, so we better get moving. But thank you very much for coming along and sharing your extensive experience. It's been great to have a chat, and we really appreciate the support of MSD, and great to have you guys on the road that are out there doing it. People obviously in their respective parts of the world can get in touch with you if they've got animal health queries and might want to have a bit of just independent advice around feet.
Absolutely. Happy to.
We'll put your direct dials on the, I don't know what we'll do anyway, I'll put contact details on the show notes so people can find you, but they can get on the MSD website and find you anyway, I'm sure, or Cooper's Animal Health in Australia. But thanks very much for your time, and we'll look forward to chatting soon.
Thanks,
Thanks for the opportunity.
Excellent. Cheers. Thanks again to Heinegger, who are proud world leaders in the manufacturing and supply of professional sheep shearing and clipping equipment. Thank you to MSD Animal Health and Allflex Livestock Intelligence. They offer an extensive livestock product portfolio focused on animal health management, all backed up by exceptional service. We thank both of these companies for their ongoing support of the Head Shepherd podcast.